You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Matt and I have the daunting task of trying to do justice to the early masterpieces of Chantal Akerman, one of the most impressive and inspiring directors to have ever lived, challenging what cinema could be over and over again while she was still in her 20s. This is the woman who made Jeanne Dielman, now often cited as the greatest film of all time, when she was 24. And she also pisses some people off, especially after Jeanne Dielman was voted best film of all time by Sight and Sound just a couple of years ago, with the encore screaming about how boring it was. Though at the same time, the film was rediscovered by so many people, falling in love with it, countless new fans being born, and Jeanne Dielman really cementing its place into one of the great films in the pantheon of cinematic history. Position it kind of had before as well, but now it holds such an important place. Though some people do think Jeanne Dielman is boring, and boring in the good way, in the sense that it slows down time, makes you focus on the minute. I would actually say she redefined suspense and what constituted action. Akerman literally lulled our senses, captivating us with just small detail, straight up stressing us out with just minute changes to what's going on in Jeanne Dielman's life. Nothing like this had ever been done before. And then she tore out the rulebook again with News from Home, one of the most powerful films ever made, in my view, despite having no actors and no traditional plot, shooting scenes of life in New York while reading letters from her mother, often pleading with her to know what she's doing or just to come home. Those two films were made back-to-back in 1975 and 1977, while Akerman was in her mid-20s. But they're not even the only films she did in the 70s that are often acclaimed as masterpieces. Her true fiction debut was I, You, He, She from 1974, where Akerman herself played the lead as a depressed woman struggling with a breakup. The first half hour of which discovered the monotony of her depression and obsession before setting out on a journey. A story she would essentially be switching up and expanding in her 1978 film, The Meetings of Anna, where Aurora Clement plays an obvious Akerman stand-in, having meaningful encounters on her long journey home. All of these four films were made while Akerman was still in her 20s, though we had to also include a fifth film here, the 1982 film A Whole Night, which is just so incredibly special, in many ways redefining cinema once again, and never really been attempted to be redone. It's composed entirely of vignettes, mostly small love stories, be they warm or unsettling, as a single night unfold. And it's also shot almost entirely in darkness. It's just, with most of these films, I just can't think of anything like it. This was a director who could reinvent herself over and over again, seeming just at an instance, covering more ground in just a few years than most acclaimed directors do in their entire career. And in this episode, we'll try to really break down her origin story here. So I'd like to pass this on to you, Matt, and let us know, what do you think about Akerman's early accomplishments in this period, in essentially her first decade of feature film?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you see some of these films as quite different. I guess structurally maybe they're pretty different, but to me, I focus a lot on the thematic sides, the psychological sides of the movie, and there does seem to be a lot of biography that leaks into the movies. So I think it's very clear that Chantal is an incredibly sensitive person. A lot of her movies are really defined by trauma. You mentioned her mother, Nellie, who was a Holocaust survivor. So her mum, features heavily in her films. Often some of the later films that we're not going to discuss today, but Is this something that you hear about from the families of Holocaust survivors of inherited trauma? There's some, suggestion that something like inherited trauma could be a physical thing, could be epigenetic, sort of transferred through the womb, but also just this idea that when you're being brought up, you're being brought up with stories that you never know if you're safe or not. Maybe at some point people change their mind about who you are as a class of people and turn up in the middle of the night and you're either carting your goods through the street on a handcart or being sent on a train to Auschwitz or something like that. So I do think, particularly in Le Rendez-vous d'Anna, there's a whole segment that talks about this. The film director in the movie Anna meets a man who is talking about just how his family life was reshaped by the war, but just how inescapable as a sort of shattering past the war was. And I mean, I often have thoughts like that. My own life walking around my hometown, there's still an awful lot of war damage, an awful lot of unrepaired buildings from the time. But she's hypersensitive to this. She's hypersensitive to the trauma of her mum, I think. And, she's hypersensitive to alienation. I think News from Home, most people would agree that it's one of the great films about alienation, if not the greatest film about alienation. And I think there's also like a focus on romance, about how frustrating romance can be. You're moving at different speeds. One of you's more interested than the other. One of you might be sort of more sensitive than the other, even though you're sort of, there's other things with attraction going on. But, I think we can get caught up in this, like you say, when you're a member of an internet forum and Jeanne Dielman is announced as the greatest film ever, and people get very upset. And I think there were a lot of conspiracy theories being bandied around. Had people sort of been stuffing ballots and organising the votes, and it was almost like after the 2016 or 2020 or 2024 elections in America, people sort of got upset about it. But when you look at the films are obviously films made by someone that's profoundly sensitive and really incredibly worthy of attention. But I think, in terms of what you're going to see when you go to see an Akerman movie, you're not going to see a diversion. It's not really about escapism. To me, it's about the human condition, the shared experience of humans. We all don't necessarily know why we're here. What was the purpose for being born? Was there a purpose? We look back at the failings and fallibilities of previous generations and are generally mystified by life, I guess, and often alienated. And this is just the normal experience of being a human, and that's what all of her films are really about. And I think, just on a deeper level, maybe she's the great director for allowing people to experience the passing of time. It's tempting to sort of focus on the sort of slightly imbecilic conversations around, is Jeanne Dielman the best film of all time? Was it votes stuffed into the Sight and Sound poll? I think that what happened because of all that is that tons of cinematheques all over the world suddenly started showing all of her films again, which was pretty amazing. Sorry, I've forgotten even what question you asked that, Chris. Just got carried away and carried on talking about this sort of early period of Akerman.
Well, I think you summed it up quite beautifully early on. Well, you still remembered my question. That all of these films are about two components. Actually, the last thing you said made a lot of sense too, that they're about time and they're about herself and her environment and her mother. I think it's worth noting that in the midst of this period, in 1980, she also shot a shorter TV documentary where she actually interviewed her mother directly as well as other Holocaust survivors. We're not talking about that film at the moment. It's quite good, but I wouldn't call it a masterpiece or great. But still very touching, especially her interview with her mother. And I think that if you watch especially the first four films here, the four major films he did in the 70s, all of them in some way relates to her or her experience. So it's literally semi-autobiographical, and she stars in it. And then News from Home, that's specifically about her and her relationship with her mother. And The Meeting is Fun. We just have such an obvious Chantal Akerman stand-in, and specifically meeting her mother in it as well, having long conversations. And even Jeanne Dielman is not instantly clear, but as you follow Akerman's career, and especially when you see her very, very last film, No Home Movie, where her mother is specifically the focus point in that documentary, you can see the connections between her mother and Jeanne Dielman. And Akerman did say that Jeanne Dielman was specifically a composite of her mother and other women she had in her life growing up, and how they lived. And I think that connection to it all is very, very clear. And I also think, and I completely agree with you, that the way she often slows down time or focuses on time, all of these 5 films, including A Whole Night, specifically deal with time in some way. And she does different things with it. But it's clear that one of her absolute greatest strengths is the way she can slow down time and make us focus on specific details or feel things differently.
I think something to me that's core about time is the lack of resolution. Just in anything that you want to talk about, like if you want to reflect on your childhood and things that happened when you were a child, if you want to reflect on past relationships, or you didn't pass an exam, or anything that happened in your life, there is no resolution really. You know, your mind can sort of dig out the same things over and over again and rethink them. And particularly in terms of relationships, you never really know how the other person is feeling. And I think this is very unusual for the cinema, really. Like, particularly stories that you're told when you're a child, they have a beginning, middle, and end. And at the end, everything is wrapped up. All the threads come together. Everyone, sort of lives happily ever after, or doesn't live happily ever after, but there's some sort of finality. Whereas I think Akerman is very much aware of the truth that there is no real resolution to anything. There are these continuous meetings with Hannah and Julia, and that you never really sort of find out, what was going on there. But I think there are people certainly who would hear all this and they would watch these films and they're like, no, absolutely not. I experience closure. I don't like to get caught up in the past. I move on and forwards. And, you can get this sort of profound rejection of the material. Obviously, that's not what's happened to us, but I think that's part of the reason that Akerman gets walked out on by some people. I'd just like to relate her actually to another director who I'm incredibly fond of. I think she, I look down the list of my favourite films. She's the name that comes up the most is Marguerite Duras. And again, she is someone who often attracted a huge amount of hatred, and she's someone who also focuses on the past, on time moving without resolution, on thorny relationships often, but that she's also an incredibly warm person. So I guess that's the type of mode of filmmaking we're watching here. Is something that's very contemplative, something that's very focused on the raw perception of time, I guess. And to people that are focused on, life is a story and I'm the hero in my own story and it has ends and objectives, it can be quite difficult for.
That's a really good point as well. I mean, I think that a lot of the people who are rejecting Jeanne Dielman, who are not getting into Akerman, it makes sense to a large extent if you're used to Hollywood movies, if that's your main preference. If you're not into contemplative cinema, like if you're not into Tar, Duras, etc., you might struggle a little bit with Akerman, even though I think she's doing some different things. I mean, I'm surprised you're calling Duras that warm, but maybe we'll do a Duras episode and we'll explore that in a bit more detail. I do love Duras.
You know what? I'm gonna have to interject though. There's a film she made, Les Enfants, with Corinne and Mascolo, and I can't remember what it was, some sort of text I read about the making of that film, that she actually was making food for everyone on set. That's how maternalistic she was, that she was essentially the caterer for that film. But also, there's a character that recurs in the movies that is one of her early lovers that she remained ever fond of. So I have always thought of her as someone that's warm, but it's like with Godard as well, Jeanne Akerman's like incredibly influenced by Godard. And I've heard someone talk about the cinema of Godard as about radical loneliness. He's someone that was often alone, particularly towards the end of his life, and was just desperate for more connection. Human beings aren't telepathic. We don't have any sort of like sci-fi bridge that we can hook up to and read each other's mind. Communication is incredibly fraught, and everyone's concerned about each other's motivations. Whereas I think people like Akerman and Godard and Duras, they wanted to bond very closely with others, but there is this radical loneliness. And I think that's the problem, is that you can watch some of their films and maybe just see the coldness of not being connected rather than this overwhelming desire to connect. I had to jump in there and defend Marguerite Duras. Actually, in terms of the journey of women filmmakers up the pantheon of sight and sound, if lists and pantheons sort of matter, I always thought that it would be India Song that would be the one that climbed to this top, Marguerite Duras. But I'm very happy that it was Jeanne Dielman.
I can say that I have both Jeanne Dielman and India Song in my own top 100 now, and India Song is higher. So we have. But maybe we'll do an episode on India Song of Marguerite Duras in the future. And thank you for that tidbit about her cooking for the entire crew on the children as well. That's really interesting to know. And anyways, to get back to Akerman, I think we might want to just jump into her film so we can get that part of the episode on the way. And we can start with her first proper feature debut, which is Elle, or as it's called in English, I, You, He, She, from 1974. This film has also been incredibly boosted into the popular consciousness. In the title sample, it ranked it was tied for 225th place. So, quite far down, but still very, very good. And it wasn't Akerman's first effort. She had already done quite a few shorts at this point. She started working as a teenager. She had already done this 60-ish minutes Hotel Monterey, which was shot in America, but was very experimental and more of a documentary of sort. But this is where she really went into fiction, and interestingly, she ended up taking the lead role herself. If you compare this to the other films we'll talk about later, this is fairly lo-fi. It's shot in 16 millimeters. In terms of sound, it's mainly voiceovers and fairly limited in terms of sound landscape. But it's still really captivating. It has a simple 3-act structure, with the first act just being Akerman alone in a room with her thoughts, followed by a journey and then the destination, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now we will add a little spoiler warning for those who don't want us to discuss the ending if you haven't seen it. In some ways, there's some clear similarities to Jeanne Dielman here, especially in how it slows down time and focus on monotony. But it's also a very different and far more raw beast of a film. What are your views on I, You, He, She, Matt?
Yeah, so it's interesting that she played the lead role as herself, as Chantal Akerman. One of the things that I find really great about her movies is just how many absolutely amazing female actresses that she worked with. So, she worked with Aurore Clément in Le Rendez-vous, and Delphine Seyrig in Jeanne Dielman. So it's interesting that she's playing herself here in her first feature, and maybe she started to get noticed enough in the community that she had some really amazing names and superb actresses wanting to work with her after that. So I think a good line about Je suis elle, it's been described as a cinematic Rosetta Stone of female sexuality. it's one of these films in the history of cinema. It's obviously been very male dominated. Sex is seen from the point of view of a man as something that's about being a conquest, whereas I remember talking to someone about sex and woman backs, and they were talking about how sex for them could be like episodic, that they might take breaks in between sort of nibbling and nuzzling to sort of clean the house or read a book or whatever, that sex can be very different from a lot of the male fantasies and representations on screen. I think you obviously have that in this movie, very much more female perspective on sex. Yeah, I just think it's, like you say, at the start of the movie is just her in her apartment. So it's again one of those films where it will tempt a lot of people who are not interested in this mode of cinema at all just to walk out. It actually reminds me of one of Michael Snow's films. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I think it's interesting because she clearly was influenced by travels in New York by other filmmakers, and some of that may come in here. It's probably the film of hers that I have least to say about, to be honest. So interested to hear your thoughts.
So there's a few things about Ayu He She that it's really interesting and striking. I think you're completely right that this is one of those films probably the hardest to get into for people not interested in this mode of cinema. I think that Jeanne Dielman probably has a much bigger draw, even for its length. I mean, I think Ayu He is like 1/3 or 1/4 of the length of Jeanne Dielman. It's about 80 minutes long. Yeah, 1/3. It's about 1/3 of the length of Jeanne Dielman. It's about 80 minutes long. And because of how lo-fi it is, because of how little dialogue, it doesn't have the same tension that Jeanne Dielman has, which I'll get into later. But for those of us who are interested in this type of cinema, Akerman has some really interesting things early on in terms of passage of time, because days are just flying by, and while Akerman herself, the character, doesn't say anything or interact with anyone in these scenes, there's the voiceover, and she does some really interesting things with the voiceover that I don't remember seeing elsewhere, in the sense that sometimes she narrates things before the representation of her on screen does it, sometimes she narrates it while she does it, and sometimes she narrates it after she does it. So it has this balance of like you hear her saying something she'll do, and then she'll be doing some other things, and then we see her doing it. So there's this interesting little loop or lapse in time that happens there. We kind of get lost in her depression and loneliness. Like, we don't know exactly what she's struggling with. We know she's writing a letter. We know she's essentially just eating sugar, throwing out her furniture, really struggling to cope with something. That's really fascinating, interesting to watch. So it can be a bit of a hard hook, and I think that people, again, who aren't interested in this will struggle. Then there's this really big shift after the first act, because each act in this film is completely different. First act is her completely on her own. Then she actually steps out to travel to a destination, and she essentially becomes a hitchhiker. She drives this truck driver, and the film changes a bit then, because you get interplay between them. You don't know exactly his intentions. There's some uncertainty around it. There's some sexual tension, possible some other elements as well. And you also have this sudden change from voiceovers to this huge monologue from the truck driver, where he kind of bears his soul to her, but at the same time it's really creepy. A lot of the things he talks about, like he talks about like his 11-year-old daughter and how he's becoming sexually aroused by her, and it's a really unsettling conversation. And then you have this final act as well, which is something completely different. Now, a spoiler warning before we get into that, but I think he went to so many different places in this film, and it's so dynamic. And the narration becomes more and more sparse as well as it goes along. But it feels like such a special film. It's raw. It's her first proper feature. But I can really understand why it's found its place in cinema history. And I do consider it a great film, even if it's not one of my personal favorites.
I wonder if it would make an interesting sort of, double bill with Marguerite Duras' Le Camion, the truck, which again, like, it's not whole Je te low, but Le Camion is essentially about a truck drive that Duras takes, and it's again that it's a bit of a despairing movie. But I think, the way you're talking about the first part of the movie, sounds very realistic to me. There's a problem that I'm thinking about on my mind, my relationship with someone, or some sort of worry, and so I end up sort of going and getting a couple of biscuits or tidying up some papers or whatever, and it's that that is how life is, and it's strange that you don't tend to see much of life in cinema. I suppose that's the whole point of cinema. I don't know if you can call it radical. Akerman is prepared to show life in cinemas, but it's more just how recognizable it is when she's doing that it's so filled with emotion somehow. Whereas if other filmmakers did it, maybe it would be much less so. And it's really hard to work out how she managed to do that. And yeah, it's interesting you talking about Jeanne Dielman being like 3 times longer. In terms of the actual passage of time, I remember when I watched Jeanne Dielman in the cinema, it felt like I'd watched this really short movie. It felt like I'd watched an 80-minute movie, which I thought was absolutely staggering. I think a lot of people, look at the time and, how long that movie is and think, well, I'm probably not going to watch that then because, I don't know if this is going to be good or not. And it's quite a lot of time to devote. But actually, to me, it really felt like I'd watched something that had happened very quickly.
That's interesting. We're going to get into Jeanne Dielman very, very soon. But before that, I'm going to add a quick spoiler warning.
Okay.
And dive into the ending of I, You, He, She, because what happens at the very, very ending has been described as the first graphic lesbian love scene in mainstream narrative cinema. And what essentially happened is that after Akerman's journey, she arrives at her exes. We kind of put things together at this point that the one she was writing letters to, and the first sentence in the film is "so I left," is that she essentially left her girlfriend, or she was kicked out. She comes back, she tries to make things up with her, and they have this kind of very awkward interplay where she's trying to get her girlfriend to serve her food. She's trying to figure out ways to stay, and her girlfriend's like, "You can stay the night, but after that you're gonna leave." And we get like probably a 10-minute or so love scene. It's very, very extended. I think some people will possibly be put off by that. Some people will probably be interested in that for some more erotic reasons, but it's shot in an interesting way as well. And I'm always like, with this ending, I'm always struggling to put into word like what exactly it does. But when you said earlier radical, and this is definitely one of the most radical scenes and endings in cinema. I don't think it had been done. It hadn't been done before. What are your thoughts on how it ended, Matt?
Yeah, so I was actually just hurriedly, wantedly looking for another candidate for a film with an extended lesbian scene, and the one that had popped into my mind was 11:14 from James Benning, but actually it's 1977, and Akerman has beaten him by 3 years. But when I watched that one as well, I thought, wow, this might have been a bit of a theatre clearer at the time, or well, it depends. It depends who was in the theatre, I suppose. But it definitely was something that was brave, and I do think it's interesting. When I talk to a lot of women, when I've got to know them in a great amount of detail, that it does seem that bisexuality is something that's incredibly common. It's something that isn't narrativized into cinema very often. So it's a really great landmark. I sort of slightly the idea that it's the first graphic lesbian sex scene in mainstream cinema. The bit I quibble with is whether this is mainstream cinema or not. I don't like.
I think it's theatrical, like it was shown at regular theatrical cinema.
Right. Okay. Rather than the special one, yeah. I guess 11:14 probably not classifying as mainstream cinema either. I don't know if there's. I don't know how much this movie grossed at the time, but when I think of mainstream, I think of something that's showing in a multiplex that lots of people are going to see.
Yeah,
I think more people have been watching these films in the last couple of years than were probably watching them at the time. Would be my guess. These films that we're talking about by Akerman are now becoming things that people. Any film buff will have to have seen. It's like if you haven't seen a bunch of Kubrick movies, it would make sort of having conversations about cinema really awkward. And I think that that's becoming the case with Akerman now. But I should know this, but I don't know how much, you know, how many screenings she was getting at the time. I don't know if you know.
I don't know either, actually, but I think it was more substantial than we think, because it did really open up the industry to her, and she was able to do Jeanne Dielman, and like you said, she was able to work with bigger actresses. So I think she actually got a decent showing. And I think when we get to meetings of Anna later as well, we kind of see like how the director in that film, Aurora Clement, kind of travels from country to country, city to city to present her films. I think that's very similar to what Akerman dealt with as well, kind of taking the film on the road and meeting people. So I do think it was fairly successful from an art film perspective, at the very least.
What I'm reading here is that at the time, Jeanne Dielman grossed worldwide $40,000, which is not very much at all. I mean, the thing is, the way you're talking about the director in Le Rendez-vous, when I watched that, it actually reminded me of. Do you remember that you guys did an interview with Adam Terrell from Third Window Films?
Yes, of course. It was a really, really interesting interview.
Yeah. I mean, well, he was talking about the same thing, right? That he would often have to, you know, accompany the films round in order to get them showed. That in order to get them screened, you would have to, you know, travel around and personally sort of show, and you would have to have drinks events before them, and bring cast members in, or, you know, just do something extra. But it didn't have a feeling to me that Anna was making a huge success of things, right? Like that, you know, it was the very fact that she was having to go to screenings that was suggesting to me that maybe not as many people were seeing these films as they could be. And I mean, I honestly think that, you know, the 2020s is the period where Akerman films are getting shown, and maybe the 2020s is the period where people are ready for her films. They're ready for something a bit more introspective. I know, is that controversial? I don't know.
No, you might be very right there. And you're definitely right that, you know, directors traveling with their films, etc., is the way to draw in more people. And the art house scene was always fairly small as well. So you might be right that more people are seeing them now, especially in the day of the Criterion releases, the streaming. It's easier than ever before to see Akerman films, and I think, like, if you look at the trajectory of ratings for Jeanne Dielman as well, and how many more people are watching it, especially if you look at Letterboxd, it's absolutely incredible. And with that, and I think we can jump into Jeanne Dielman itself, Akerman's greatest triumph, the film that's, as we said earlier, is being heralded as the best film of all time in some spaces. It was voted at the top of Sight and Sound list, and both before but especially after it's exploded in the cinematic pantheon. This is a film that, like you said, people just need to see it. If you're a cinephile, you need to see Jeanne Dielman. Everyone needs to see it, even if you're not into this type of cinema. We know some people personally that have resisted so far, which is almost shocking. Hint, Saul, do watch Jeanne Dielman. But yeah, this is a film that's grown on me every single time I've seen it. And I thought it was a masterpiece the first time I saw it as well. It's just such an intriguing film. Like I said in my intro, this is a film that really redefines what action is, because there's very little dialogue. Most of the film is focused specifically on Jeanne Dielman. She's I would say, middle-aged-ish mother who supports her household by sleeping with men. She's working. She's a sex worker. She has one client a day, and she has a very, very specific routine in terms of how she does the house chores. She keeps herself busy. How she doesn't necessarily, like, the way she just tries to pass time and not think about her life. What really impresses me with Jeanne Dielman is that, despite how some people describe it as slow or dull or boring, I think that there's not really that much slowness or repetition in this film. We essentially start off from almost the very beginning of the film. Like, we know that she's a sex. We see her, how she works. Like, for a couple of minutes, just to set her up as this kind of very archetypical, probably middle-class woman that's a very familiar trope in France. And then we learn she's a sex worker. And you have that juxtaposition followed by her ritual of essentially cleaning afterwards, cleaning herself. And we really get drawn into that. We kind of learn more about her. And the film never, ever repeats itself. Like we start essentially learning her routines the first day when she does them the right way, if you will. And then once we have caught up with her the next day, we start to see immediately the routines slip up as something's clearly wrong in her world, and it becomes increasingly tense. I would actually describe Jeanne Dielman as a psychological thriller in many ways, because it is unnerving. You see her unravel before her eyes. Akerman really manages to induce the film with so much tension, but also just humanity and interest. It's a film unlike anything I've seen before. I don't think anyone's managed to present action the same way again, because you really follow her every movement. Like if she does something with her hands or she does something off, or like at some points we see, because we notice her exact routine the first day, and then when she starts messing certain things up, like she misses a button, for instance, like we stop, we notice, we tense up because we see something is wrong. And just that level of detail, that level of pulling you into the film, I would say it's one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of cinema. I think that she just completely changed the way audiences interact with film with Jeanne Dielman. And for that, I think it's a very, very worthy choice for the top spot, even though, as I said, I do prefer in India song, which is from the same year, ironically. But what do you think about Jeanne Dielman, Matt?
Yes, I think, Jeanne Dielman's very dear film to me. Like I said, even though it's 3 hours, 22 minutes in length, it didn't feel anything like that to me at all. It felt like it slid by very easily, that it was, I guess, hypnotic. And a lot of that is helped by the fact that, Delphine Seyrig is playing the main role of the housewife, right? And I think Delphine Seyrig was one of the people that first, got me into cinema when I was at university. One of the local cinemas showed last year in Marienbad. And, that's another sort of dreamlike film, I guess. Maybe Seyrig is good in dreamlike films. I'm just imagining her in Harry Kumel's Daughters of Darkness as well. But that it's not much of a chore for me to watch Delphine Seyrig for 3 hours, just because she's such a fantastic actress. I think there are things about that movie. So the scene actually that captivates me the most is she's making meatloaf at one point, and she's having to spend a lot of time kneading mince, sort of kneading eggs into it, I believe, as well. And to me, like the film is obviously about like some structural exploitation. She's having to bring up her son. It seems hard. Times are hard. It's hard to get money. It's a time of when women face glass ceilings in workplaces, if they were even allowed into workplaces, generally might have had to sort of been in a typing pool, or there's not very many jobs available. So there's this sort of, has had to end up being involved in sex work in order to make ends meet. But also just like people who have been on the forum, are either sort of interested or not annoyed with the fact that I'm vegan. But when I watch that scene, to me, that's again like just huge structural exploitation, that would be the standard sort of, we talk about her as middle class as well. Like in essence, it's funny, what does middle class mean? Because it's obviously not something to do with money necessarily, in that she's clearly middle class, but you wouldn't refer to her as working class, even though she is working. She's doing sex work, but it's about the mannerisms and rituals and routines, and essentially, one of the routines is you cut certain meals, certain nights, and, one of those is meatloaf. And you literally, as you're seeing her body abused, you also just see this sort of like almost ultra abuse that's evolved in producing this really rather tasteless meal. Meatloaf isn't some sort of, luxurious thing to eat. I find bits like that to be chilling during Jeanne Dielman, and I think it's like you say, there are circles within circles in the movie, and I think repetition and having motifs reflect through movies is something that very successful filmmakers do, and that happens within Jeanne Dielman. I don't know if you're stretching it a bit, to talk about it as an action movie. I don't think I'd be able to describe it as that myself unless my tongue was in my cheek.
Movie, I call it a psychological thriller.
Okay. I guess it is a psychological thriller. I don't think that you necessarily, a lot of it is just the fact that, like you say, that things are obviously unraveling a little as the movie goes on, but you don't necessarily expect for it to unravel in such an extreme way as it does at the end. But I do think it's a great film. My own personal favourite from Duras is a portrait of a young girl in Belgium in the 60s. In Brussels, I think it is, actually. Like you, this isn't my favourite, but I do think it's a great film, for sure.
I think you mentioned the ending there, so we can add a quick spoiler warning here as well, because I think a lot of what we can talk about with Jeanne Dielman has to do with the ending. So it's going to be a bit of a longer discussion after the spoiler warning. If you're ready for it, we hope that most of our listeners have seen Jeanne Dielman before. If not, watch it and come back to us. So one of the things that to me stands out and also makes the film even more rewatchable is the final scenes where as John goes through her day, she has her first client. Essentially, the film is split into 3 acts. You have the first day where things are fairly normal. She has a client, and we see her response after a normal client. She has the second day where things are starting to unravel. We see her very disheveled after her client leaves. And then you have the third day where we essentially see her not being able to take it anymore, whatever that is. And she ends up killing her client. And the final scene is her just sitting there with blood on her hand on the table. Just kind of being very, very easy with herself. And this motif of her just sitting there and easy with herself in her own thoughts goes through the entire film. And one of the reasons why I think Jeanne Dielman is even greater on rewatch, and why it has gone up in my esteem every time I've rewatched it, that it becomes even more of a psychological drama, because the first time you're watching her unravel and you're not sure where it's going, you feel tense. The other times you start to kind of pick up like what made her do it. Like, what were the details that changed in her life that made her snap? Because they start even earlier, they start quite early. And the more times I watched it, the earlier I pick up warning signs that something is going off. And I think that is, I think the whole question of why she did what she did, that's one of the things that's been debated endlessly for years, and even more so after it shot up in popularity. But I just think that aspect of the film just makes it really, really intriguing.
Well, I almost felt it was a device, Chris, and that I didn't necessarily think it was realistic. I think, there are examples of female sex workers being, involved in sort of major crimes. Eileen Wuornos sort of springs to mind, and there was a film made about her. It's called Monster, I think. But it didn't actually seem to me to be particularly realistic, the ending. But also I didn't think that mattered. It was almost a statement of extreme frustration by the filmmaker and maybe the character that makes the film a great film. It makes it what really is necessarily an answer, because I don't really think that would have happened. But I think it is. I think it's hard to imagine. And now in Europe, but I think, when you speak to women about things that were going on around the time that this film was being made, I think, I think my mum certainly, sort of talks about the fact that women were often in England, they were taught, certain things are going to be happening when you get married. And essentially, when they happen, you need to lie back and think of England. Which sounds completely ludicrous now, but that is what women were taught. That essentially a husband had certain needs to take care of, and that you needed to lie back and think of something else whilst it was happening. And really, that's how sex is in this movie. It is something incredibly grotesque and mechanical, and I think, there was something talked about, in feminism at the time, female orgasmic rights. It's this idea that sex isn't just about a man getting relief, both partners, should be achieving some form of climax, but that wasn't the experience of many women in the way that, we had constructed our societies. I was actually watching The Singing Detective, a sort of British miniseries yesterday, and it had the same thing. It had sex where it was just a sort of, a man's very heavy man sort of imposing himself on a woman who would just be sort of lying back and having to think about something else. And I think that, there's a movie called Sex Life of the Belgians that portrays something very different. But I think in the era, a lot of people, particularly married middle-class women, their sex lives would have been incredibly boring or frustrating or traumatic. And I think, something of the movie speaks to that, and it's almost the scene that happens at the end is about resistance much more than it is about a particular crime that, may or may not be realistic, or, what was she thinking? I don't know if you'd agree with that, Chris.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think the first time I saw the film, I had a similar reaction to that. I didn't understand what made her do it, and I did think it was a very off decision on her part, because the act is done, her client is just lying on the bed. She sees the scissors and she stabs him in the throat. It's something that you just seem to come out of nowhere. I think on rewatches, I think that there are other alternatives. You mentioned orgasmic rights there, and that is one of the big discussions about the film, like whether or not Jeanne Dielman had an orgasm, whether or not she, if that's why she killed him, she had an orgasm, and she couldn't allow herself to do that. That is one of the takes. It's possible. I think that one of the driving forces that we see through the film is her conversations with her son, which are quite odd. Like, essentially, we have 2 nights with him where before he goes to bed, he has this kind of, he shares his feelings on things, and they're quite misogynistic in a lot of ways. It's like, oh, if I was a woman, I would do this, or how could a woman have sex with a man she doesn't love, or random things like that, without obviously knowing what his mother does to make money. And I'm not sure to what extent that drives things. But I've noticed 2 things about it. Is that first, that's around the time when she starts slipping up, and I also think, from a psychological perspective, that a lot of people also discuss this, whether or not Jeanne Dielman is a film about OCD, and I think it might very well be to a large extent. But I think the film also comments on how a lot of women aren't or weren't really living at the time. They essentially numb themselves down with housework and repetition. They do the same things. They don't allow themselves time to think or reflect on their lives. They just essentially perform their role. And I think that as the film progresses, Jeanne Dielman has a couple of these moments where she's done in advance, and she's just sitting there alone with herself and with her own thoughts. And I think she might be starting to reflect on her life for the first time, and I don't necessarily think she likes what she thinks about. And I think those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of certainty, and just her repetition being broken, like her routine being broken, I think that's part of the things that really just end up making her snap and not being able to bear with her life anymore. So that's my interpretation of what's happening.
I mean, I think the idea about, that before she stabs the guy that she had an orgasm, I think it's probably the best theory. If theories really, really matter here, to me, it's, a lot more like a thematic gesture. But, I think it explains, if she was really not feeling it that day, presumably she wouldn't have let the man into the apartment. And so the orgasm sort of explains why things may have happened as it did, even does matter. I'm thinking of Hanneke's Kasha as well. This people always sort of wanting to talk about, how was the camera where it was. It kind of doesn't really matter in the end. It is much more of these. There's this Thoreau quote that most men live lives of quiet desperation that I think is really good, and I like the quote, but I have heard women say before, isn't that's also women, isn't it? Which it definitely is. It's just so you are watching a movie about a life of quiet frustration, I guess, and in the end, it sort of stops being quiet. But I think what elevates the movie is that there is there's a lot of mystery to it, and there's maybe even mystical qualities. I think I mentioned this to some people who like seen the film quite a lot, and they'd never really noticed that. I think 3 times Jeanne leaves the apartment with her son, and they go on a walk somewhere, and they come back, and at no point have we any idea why they've left the apartment. There's no clues provided. What are these evening rendezvous about? Answers on a postcard. But also, I think there's a scene towards the end where it's a sort of dark scene in the kitchen, and you can see all these sort of waves of shadow and light hitting the wall. And there's something, very sublime beyond words about that scene. Something mystical, something about fate and the passage of time, and you're born into these circumstances and they're hard to escape. I think that's something that maybe is different about Akerman and other filmmakers, in that, a lot of filmmakers would make a very unrealistic film about someone that was born into difficult circumstances and them overcoming it. And we get taught a lot that people are able to overcome the material circumstances and the systems of ideas and thinking of the time. My personal belief is that, they can't. And that actually, when you see the exceptions, they're almost the exceptions that prove the rule. But again, I think, a lot of people might rebel about that. They would be talking about Jeanne and saying, she didn't need to do what she did at the end. There must have been other ways out for her. But I actually, tend to think, you often think about human beings as sunflowers. If you water a sunflower, the sunflower will grow taller. If you get the sort of shade and sunlight, it will grow taller. If you sort of scrape black fly off of it or put some pesticide on it, it will grow taller. And whereas if you don't do any of these things, you're not going to get a great sunflower. And human beings are very sensitive machines, and very sensitive sunflowers, I think. And I think some of that to me comes through in her films. Is that too fatalistic for you, Chris?
Perhaps, but you might be very, very right. And this, I think, is a very good time to move on to news from home as well, because I think that ties in even more to this kind of almost to this coldness you're talking about, this question of what humans are and what they can be and what connections and all of these things. Because to me, this is an even greater achievement than Jeanne Dielman, as if without having a single actor on camera and no dialogue, no exchange of dialogue whatsoever, Akerman manages to create a genuinely touching and heart-wrenching story, tapping into her own relationship with her mother. The film simply features shots from around New York City, shooting tracking shots through windows of cars, capturing the streets, shooting from it in the underground, just general collective traffic. And in all of it, Akerman isn't there. We never see her on screen. We never even hear her words or her letters back to her mother. It's entirely composed in terms of the actual narration of her mother's letters. She is begging and begging and begging to know how Chantal is doing. I'll use her first name in this case because she's talking to her daughter. How is she doing? Is she alright? Does she have money? Like, how is she living? She wants just any sign that she's okay. A lot of semi-emotional manipulation of trying to get her to come home as well. And we never hear back from Chantal. Like, what's happening here? Essentially, we have to read between the lines in her mother's letters. Like, we know even less about Chantal than her mother knows. But from her mother's letter, she's like, you didn't answer my questions. You didn't, like, why are your letters so short? Why aren't you saying anything? And we essentially get this sense that Akerman is just drifting through the city. That she has no connections in the city. That she might be struggling quite a bit, which from what we know about her life at this point, it is quite accurate as well. And it's really, really haunting how it manages to do it through these tools. There's so many dynamics going on at the same time, from worrying about Akerman's own life to just the quiet reflections about alienation, to perhaps thoughts about their own parents and how we communicate with them. And as someone who has left my own country as well, and are in a similar situation to what Akerman perhaps was in that time, just older and in a more stable situation, the sense of being so far away from your family and how we deal with them, how we communicate with them, it still hits very, very hard. I think it's a very, very affecting film with so much powerful juxtaposition and so much you can really, really read into and get from this film. It's a true work of beauty to me, and I would probably categorize it as her second best film after Jeanne Dielman. What do you think about the News from Home, Matt?
Yes, I probably got more to say about this one than the others. I watched this one in the cinema very recently, and it was an amazing experience. So I think there are two things going on here. I think, so as you say, the relationship with the mother is revealed by the letters. I wondered if it was a bit too harsh the way Chantal had been presenting her mother in this film. Like you say, the letters obviously are incredibly manipulative. It's all sort of drip feeding her a bit of money and, trying to get her to come home. But I mean, in reality, so these are real letters, obviously, but, in reality, my understanding is that her mum actually encouraged her to, not become this sort of housewife role. She encouraged her to, have a career, to do something that she was interested in. So you don't get much of a sense of that in this film. And, I think I've had the same sort of thing with my mum, that she is a huge worrier. I'd have to be careful about thinking when I phoned her up to tell her about something that happened, or if I told her about something that would happen, would she worry too much? So maybe that I shouldn't say. But I think in this movie, a lot of the way that the mum's communicating comes off as really manipulative. Whereas I sort of wondered if that was the whole picture. I had this sort of own situation where, my mum didn't really want me to move out of home when I did. I was becoming an adult, and, I needed to move out and do my own thing, and she really didn't want me to do that. And I think there's this delicate balance between caring about your children and smothering them. And I don't think that balance is necessarily reflected particularly well in this movie. They are all real letters. I do think so. I mean, that's one of the main threads of the movie is the letters from the mother. And I think I think even if you watch the movie entirely without sound, I think you just turn the sound off on TV, I still think it would be a very amazing movie. I don't think it needs that content. You can just watch it as a documentary about New York. I think when I went to New York for the first time, I felt that I'd been to a lot of places that were multicultural. My hometown is multicultural. But whereas with my hometown, I can say, there's a particular part where there are lots of people from Jamaica. There's a particular part with Somalis. In New York, you saw people from everywhere, essentially. That it was the capital of the world. I think you can see that in the movie, just how different everybody is. Different hairstyle, different clothing. I think something that's very different from New York today is that everybody's thin, right? Which is, we've all been fed so much processed food now, so you can just see it as a documentary about New York. But I think there really is a lot of content in there about alienation, and some of it's really subtle. Randomly, I'm going to mention James Benning again, because I often think with James Benning's documentary movies, people neglect to think about just how well chosen some of the shots are, and how there is a hidden commentary in some of the choice of shots. One of my favorite scenes in News from Home happens in a subway, and I think it's essentially some of the decor in the particular section of subway that she's chosen makes it look, there are these Greek columns. I forget the difference between diachronic and Corinthian columns that was banged into me by rote when I was at school, but they have those sorts of columns there. But also, it feels very much like a tawdry temple, like you are watching a world that has somehow degraded, that you're watching a city at the time which was rife with crime, that is very much based on the consumerism. You have the 24-hour stores, you don't care about workers anymore, that it's very easy to be on your own in the midst of a huge amount of people. And my understanding about this trip that Akerman took to New York is that she found it very difficult to connect with anyone. And I find it the same. And there are some places that you can go and you sit down in the first bar that you come across and someone's talking to you and you make a connection. And there are some places where you go where connections are not going to be happening. People are looking for something very particular if they want to make a connection. And I think particularly traveling in America, a lot of people I end up talking to were literally con men, people trying to make some money from fooling me or something like that. So I think, she captures this very well, that it's a place where there's lots of different people, that it's very hard to connect, that it's really easy to be lonely. And like I said, I think at the start podcast, that is one of the great films about alienation. And I think when we're thinking about feminism in her films as well, there's a great scene on a subway train where she's filming the subway train, and there's this, actually she's probably one of the only overweight people that you see in the film. There's this older gent who's staring her down, he's staring down at camera like, who are you? I haven't given you permission to shoot on this train. And he spends a lot of time sort of thinking about, should I go over there and disrupt the filmmaking? And I think that's again one of my favorite shots in the film. It's very hard to make a connection, and the only real connection that you see happening in the movie is a guy who's irate about the fact that there's this woman with a camera on the subway.
That's really interesting, Matt. I mean, I think that you are right, that especially fans of Benning might love this film with the audio track off. And I think even with it off, I would appreciate it a lot too, but I'm not sure if I would love it. I mean, I'm not the biggest Benning fan, though I do think a few of his films are great. To me, what's really special and powerful here is the relationship that's being developed between Akerman and her mother with the juxtaposition of the city. I think that if you read the letters without the city, it might still be interesting. If you just showed the shots without letters, it would still be interesting. But together, it becomes a masterpiece to me. So I wouldn't want it without one of those two parts. In terms of the manipulation from the mother, I mean, I don't really think it's that severe. I mean, I think that this is probably, or maybe families are different, but this is, I think, very similar to what a lot of mothers or family members would be writing to their children when they're abroad and when they're away, especially in terms of just getting news from them. I think that we shouldn't read into what her mother is doing is overtly sinister and things. She might not even be thinking about it. They might be unconscious as well, because these things are things that it's ingrained into them, that people want their children, they want their children safe, they want to know about their children. So I didn't come away from this film with some kind of negative feelings towards Akerman's mother. I think it's more just the dynamic between them was explored in a very, very interesting and powerful way. You get so much insight just from these letters into both of them somehow. So
yes, I think you're right. There's nothing sinister about what the mum's doing, but I think sometimes this idea of water torture springs to mind. That this occasional dripping of water sends you mad, and each drip of water or each letter it's not being calculated to send her daughter mad, but that there is a cumulative effect of it's just emphasizing how little success and how few connections that Akerman is making when she's in New York. And it's very painful, despite it not being meant to be painful at all.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Matt. I think that lack of connection that we're sensing through these letters, through all of this, it's one of the most powerful aspects of the film. So if someone hasn't seen News from Home, please run out and seek it out. But this sense of connection is also a thread that runs through Akerman's next film, The Meetings of Anna, from 1978. And this is perhaps the most quote-unquote conventional film we'll be discussing today, in that it is more dialogue driven in nature. It's more of a clear narrative. I think that fans of Romer or Linklater, for instance, will be very comfortable with this. I mean, it doesn't have the same kind of time or experimental dimension that a lot of the other Akerman films we've been talking about so far have. I just think it's a great starting point for anyone who kind of wants to dip their feet into Akerman. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I do think that this has a really interesting connection to IU He She, as the Akerman's stand-in Anna Silver goes on the opposite journey, in this case the road home. Now she's older and a somewhat accomplished director. Like you said, she's traveling, showing her film around. She has a really tight schedule. She's not living brilliantly, but she has a degree of acclaim. She gets, journalists. She has a busy schedule, to put it like that. But even with the increase in success, and it's a form of worldly travel. It goes through at least 3 nations. We go to Germany, Belgium, and France. She's still very clearly struggling with a degree of alienation. She's struggling with depression. She's in a similar place to what we found Akerman in IU He She. And the film is also composed by a very similar encounter to the one that Akerman had with the truck driver, in that we kind of shift the focus of the film onto an encounter, and that encounter often goes into more of a monologue where we explore their inner life and who they are. And the film is just really captivating. It's somber, it's melancholic, it has that really, really clear need to make connections in this world. And through all of this, it also has this really magical feeling. This is actually Akerman film I watched the most. I made it a bit of a New Year movie. I tried to watch it on New Year because it just has this really transitory power. Almost a rebirth, but this incredible, this transition through different lives, through different connections, through different movements. It feels like the way you take stock at the end of the year as well. So that made a powerful connection for me. But yeah, I do think that this is one of her more unsung films, because News from Home is in the Sight and Sound Top 100. The Meeting in Savannah is nowhere present, but I do think it's one of Akerman's most powerful films, for sure. What are your views on this one, Matt?
I think this one definitely has a claim to be made as Akerman's most accomplished film. I really enjoy watching it. I can see myself going into the same phase as you, picking a time of year to watch it and finding new stuff in it every time. I think it's funny in terms of, I often think about, alienation and struggling to make connections as being almost like chasing after people, and then, that they're not interested, or that you become desperate. It's actually kind of the opposite here. She meets this gent, Heinrich Schneider, is played by Helmut Green, and he takes her out to the countryside to see his country home, to meet his daughter, to meet his mother, and he's very clearly saying to her, look, there's no effort involved here. You can just fit into this prearranged life as a jigsaw piece. I'm doing everything for you here. It's all set up. Just come on in. And she's clearly resistant to that I think there's a lot of dialogue in the movie. There's a lady she meets whose son wants to get with Anna. There's clearly a lot of male interest, but nothing's happening. And I don't know whether Anna, she doesn't want to be in a relationship. She doesn't want to be defined with relationship, or that it's more that however much these particular men are interested in her, that she's not reciprocating that. She's not really finding anyone that she feels, strongly about, however much the men that she runs into are feeling strongly about her. So it is, I think it's also very interesting, there's a bit of male perspective in this movie as well. She has Heinrich in her hotel room and he's like, great, I've got lucky. And I think that is part of the male experience, right? That it's about getting lucky, that often sexual encounters are incredibly unplanned. You ask a lot and, generally get told no, and then suddenly one evening something just happens. And there's this bit where he gets told to put his clothes on, basically, halfway through for whatever reason. Anna has sort of lost interest, and then she tells him to put his clothes on. He gives this little speech about what life is like. You may think that something is going very right in your life and it's coming along very nicely, and then suddenly you get told to put your clothes on. So I think that was a pretty amazing part of that one. It's almost paradoxical, this, that she's obviously pushing away a lot of interest from suitors, to use the old term, but that she's also incredibly lonely. So I think one of the things that I like about the movie that shows that the most is that she will overshare to the concierge. There's this call to Italy that she'll be trying to get to go through, and then she'll be telling the concierge why that is, particular reason for the call or why she's going out. And, the concierge doesn't care, obviously. Concierge is just there to facilitate things for you, but not, and she doesn't appear to know that, and she's oversharing. So I think it's one of those movies that is pulling your heart all over the place, because you're like, well, you're clearly very lonely. There's clearly lots of people who, seem to be very nice people that want to be involved in your life. So Heinrich particularly, he doesn't come off, he certainly, maybe I sort of missed the point of the movie, but he seems to be a very nice man, an interesting man. But it's this sort of loneliness and pushing people away at the same time that has a real effect on me when I'm watching it.
No, I think you're right. I think one of the big changes from Ayu Hishi is that the encounters she have, that they're far more. But I mean, we only had one proper encounter with a man in that previous movie, but all of the encounters here really are quite sympathetic. Like, a lot of them want something from her, some of them don't, but a lot of them, like, she has a meeting with an old friend of her mother's who's also the mother of a man she was engaged to, and she's really pushy towards like trying to get her back together with her son. But like there's a degree of sympathy and love, connection, or empathy given to all of the people she meets on her journey in one way or another. Like, that's one of those things that it's almost not drama free, but it's like it's without that sting, it's without the hatred, it's without a lot of. It has a very different mode than a lot of films. It's just really interesting how it's just has this like somber melancholy of sorts, just kind of drifting through, and she can't really make that connection, or she doesn't want to, or she's conflicted herself. And I do agree, like, Heinrich doesn't come off overly badly at all. I think she even stops and might even consider a life with him at one point there. Like, those kind of missing connections and melancholy really infuse the film with so much power. I think it's also worth noting that this isn't really a spoiler because it happens quite early. Like you mentioned, she wants to make that call to Italy, and essentially what we're told later is that she had a romantic encounter with a woman in Italy, and she's trying to, like, she's only been maintaining that through phone calls so far, and she kind of wants to continue that. And there's even a scene in the film where she comes out to her mother for the first time as possibly as being bisexual or having romantic feelings for women specifically, and that's really interesting to watch as well. So there's so much going on in this film, and I think we can do a slight spoiler warning and go on to the ending as well, because like you have all of these encounters along the way, and when she gets back to Paris, what happens is that she essentially runs into her on and off again boyfriend. He picks her up, they go to a hotel room, they're meant to kind of have sex, and things doesn't quite go that way after all. We can discuss a little bit about why, but I do think it's interesting just the very way it ends. So after all of this time, after all of these interactions with people, both people from her past and strangers, all of these connections, we actually end up in the same place as Ayuhishi starts, which is the Chantal Akerman stand-in coming in to her apartment, being there all alone, laying down on her bed, and the film just staying with her on the bed while she listens to her messages, in this case, on her answering machine. And it's quite a long scene, and I think just the fact that, you know, in Ayuhishi she spends so much time in her bed in the early portion of the film. With here she's back in her bed listening. I just think that for those who have followed her career so far and kind of do see her films as at least in part autobiographical, like you kind of see that she still has the same loneliness, she still has the same depression, and she's still in a very similar place. And I think that hits very hard.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously we're different at different points in our life, but some things stay the same and some things carry on reflecting. And it's quite a controversial thing to talk about, but often when I watched it, you know, I wondered if she was autistic. I think a lot of the ways that her encounters with people go, I think while some people may relate to them, like other people may think that they're slightly unusual. And often wondered if they were a bit autistic. I think you mentioned OCD as well. You know, there's a collection of different pathologies, and it's very dangerous to pathologize people because, you know, then it becomes all about labels rather than, you know, about the person. And I think the whole point of watching Akerman's films is to try and think about alienation, how to overcome them. I did wonder about that quite a lot watching several of her films, to be honest, if that's part of the reason why there's difficulty making connections. And, you know, sometimes when connections are made that they're unsatisfactory. I think some of that comes much more into Toute, nuit, where we see so many different couples coming together or drawing apart. Particularly, actually, you know, I'm sorry, segueing into Toute, nuit without really trying to, but there's this scene I love in it where there's a man and a woman dancing in a bar, and their dancing is really jerky because, you know, it seems that they don't know how to dance, which is quite relatable. You know, I think most people don't know how to dance, but that it's that kind of jerky dance which may essentially be what is happening with a lot of the interactions that she's having. I don't know what you think about that, Chris, whether you would see her as someone has difficulties in social interactions.
I mean, I think that's something that it's quite clear in this film. Like, to what extent it is autobiographical, to what extent it's fiction, it's obviously hard to say. So I don't really want to assume that every single thing we see in these films are exactly how Akerman felt herself. So I can say that she did one other documentary specifically about herself later in her life, which, if I recall correctly, I think it was called La Basse, where, you know, she's once again, you know, just locking herself in her room. She's traveled somewhere. She has people. She was meant to meet them, but she doesn't want to, and she's kind of just locked away and just going through, like, almost exactly as in Ayuhishi as well. Just the entire film is almost like she doesn't leave, and that was from 2006, I think. So, we're talking quite a few decades after these films.
That's it. I think there are parts about you that change and parts that stay the same, you know, that you will develop as a person. You'll be more able to deal with people, you know, you become more interesting, but there is still that person inside of you who might prefer to lock yourself away in a room whilst the party's happening. I have a friend like that as well. You know, her husband would, he'd call a party and everyone would be getting up to all sorts downstairs, and she'd go up to the bedroom and read a book.
No, it's true, yeah. And I think that, you know, Akerman says she's probably an introvert, and she clearly has depression. I mean, we know that from her life as well, that she has depression. So a lot of these things tie in together. I think that she's someone who, in these films, like shown that she wants connections, but she struggles to maintain them, and she struggles to know how to interact as well. And that makes all of these 4 films we've been talking about so far, maybe except Jeanne Dielman, into like this autobiographical story of her, and that's something we can follow throughout her career. And maybe we'll do a late films of Chantal Akerman. Maybe we'll stop in at different points in her life in the future and talk about other films and how her story continues, how her craft continues, because you can really, from her films, it's almost like a running thread is her life and her relationship with her mother to the very end, and that is a very powerful journey to follow. But the next film, interestingly, which you kind of segued into a little bit already, A Whole Night, that's a film that, contrary to The News from Home, it has so many characters. It's a film made up entirely of vignettes, most of them probably around 2 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. Most characters not repeating, though some do. And it's mostly just about connections in the night. It's such a strange film. I've seen it, I believe, 3 times now, each on different type of media, because like I think when I first watched it, it was like a very poor DVD. Like I couldn't really make out a lot of what was happening. It was so dark. And now finally I got to the proper Blu-ray restoration that's out now, and I'm happy I did that, because finally I can see more of within the darkness. But it's such a darkly shot film, and it chooses to be darkly shot. Light isn't always exactly where you expect it to be either. It really just lingers in the night for a lot of it. So that's a really interesting technical choice. But at the heart of the film, the core of the film, are just all of these, I would say, destinies in the night. You have romance, you have some unsettling situations, you have breakup, you have people getting together, like all within a couple of minutes, mostly without any real dialogue, or just 1 or 2 lines per character. Some of it are just almost unbelievable in how it goes. Like you have this almost dream-like magical moments of an older couple decides that they'll just go out and dance, while other times you have things that look like stalking, or people who don't want their date to end, and it switches and you even get breakups. It kind of switches between these romantic destinies, but the core in almost every single segment is just romance through the night. It's so atmospheric. It never gives you time to rest with any of the characters, so it kind of just becomes this fleeting narrative, again, just slipping away like the night. And once more, I'm repeating myself a lot here, but it's a film unlike anything else I've really seen before or since. What are your views on A Whole Night, Matt?
Yes, I think not every scene has a couple, and sometimes there will be a man on his own, just sat on his bed. But even when it's just a guy on his own, that is almost a relationship scene as well, because of the context it's been placed in. It's been about the fact they're alone, and maybe that they're wishing that they were actually with someone. So even when you see just a man on his own, essentially doing nothing, fiddling with the fridge, that even that becomes a romantic scene. And I think it's worth for people when they're watching this to try and remember some of the details of what's happening, because as Chris, you point out, sometimes, occasionally those people will come back towards the end of the movie, and if you remember what you'd initially seen, there's actually some humor in there in a couple of places. So I watched this in the cinema. I've like you, I've watched it in other media as well. I've watched it on my PC as well, and in the cinema, and I've got the disc of it. And in the cinema, you do get quite a lot of laughter at bits and pieces, relatable things happening, or things, being slightly surprising. I do think making films that happen at night like this, it can be quite a powerful thing to do. So one of my favorite movies is, again, it's a French movie by Yann Gonzalez called Les Rencontres d'Après Minuit. You in the Night in English, from 2013, and that's about, essentially a sex party. It's a sex party where no sex actually happens, but it's just about how human existence changes after midnight or around midnight, that you're living in a more surreal atmosphere. I guess the night is more surreal. You're not concerned about, I need to make this telephone call, or I need to do this piece of work. You're more authentic maybe at night. You're on your own time. Often, any encounters that you're going to have are ones that you're looking to have. So I think making a film about people meeting in the night is something that's very strong to do. I also, there's particularly a scene at the end between a man and a woman at a train station, which particularly tugs at me. It's about the strangeness of relationships. I often see people, for example, who you can just see that they're going to break up within the next 2 years, but they can't move it along. It's like a constipation. Something's gone wrong. Things are never going to be the way that they were, but they're working through it, and it's going to take a long time to work through it, and it's very painful, and there's lots of conflicting sort of emotions. Why can't it be like it was? Why was I ever attracted to this person? Why am I attracted to these type of people? Just sort of lots of feelings like that. And I think something that I was talking about at the start was this idea that life can proceed without resolution, and that a lot of the relationships proceed without resolution. You end up getting married young to someone that you're not suited to. That marriage will continue to the day that you die, and you never really resolve your sort of sexual self or your relationship self. And there's just a lot of material like that in the movie. Some material is very charming. I mentioned the scene where the jerky dancing is happening. Some of the scenes are very banal, some less so, some humorous, but it does have its own peculiar atmosphere to it that's very different from a lot of other movies. Although I think it's actually something that she was thinking about maybe many years before. I don't know if I'm going to get this right, but there's one of her very early films that isn't particularly amazing. It's her INSAS entrance exam. I think it is, where she's shooting some scenes at night that have some sort of surrealism, access to surrealism, that she was obviously thinking of making something like this for quite a long time, and I think it's a really great movie. And I think, as with all of her movies, really, it's something that you can watch over and over again. And maybe this one isn't for watching every Christmas or every New Year, but it's more, when you come to a peculiar moment in your life, when you're sort of up late at night and wondering about things, that this would be a great one to rewatch.
That's some very strong thoughts there, Matt. I think you're absolutely right that even in the scenes where no romantic connections are expressively shown, that sense still lingers there. And I think when you talk about the night and surrealism, I think that's spot on too. Like there is something thoroughly dreamlike and magical about this film in ways that none of her other films really had. I think it's also interesting that essentially she followed up the meetings of Anna, which were segmented with even shorter segments of meetings and encounters, and kind of followed that line a little bit through it and went into that, because meetings of Anna also had a certain magic in these encounters, but here she sets it all during the night. She envelops it in the night, and she manages to have these moments and these sparks. And yes, I can see this. I mean, like I said, I've seen this 3 times now. I think it's very enjoyable each time I rewatch it. I think it's definitely a film you can see over and over again. And honestly, that's the case with all of these films we've been talking today as well. There's so much rewatch value here in all of them, especially for me the last 4. But do you have any final thoughts on this period in Akerman's life and the films we've been talking about here today, Matt?
I just think it is worth sort of being clear that we've chosen Chantal Akerman to talk about. It's not just another episode. I really do think that she's a very special director, and I think that feeling builds up as you watch her body of work. If you watch all of the films, I think there's more of a cohesiveness to the entire oeuvre than I would say there is with any other director. And it is something like certain types of hot food where the more you eat, the sort of more the spice builds up. The more of the films that you watch, the more overwhelming that they become. And as well, we were talking about, Akerman's characters trying to make connections. Akerman herself trying to make connections. I think her films are an effort to make a connection with you. It's a reaching out. I'm going to quote Marguerite Duras again. She made a short film called Les Mains Négatives. And an image in that is of very ancient people putting paint on their hands and putting their hands on cave wall. That they want their existence to have touched others, to sort of reach out over time. I think it's the Magdalenian caves, if I recall, and I think that is also what Akerman is trying to do. She's a profound filmmaker, an empathetic filmmaker, someone that maybe has been haunted by the past, has been haunted by the context that she's been born into. This post-war context where you get told all the stories of the horrible things that people have done to each other, that you're also born and the Iron Curtain's in place. And, her film from the East is also, she looks at that a lot. She looks at colonialism in Le Folie en Mer, that she is really touched by human suffering and wants to alleviate human suffering and wants to connect with people, and that she really, the more and more of her films that you watch, the more and more that you become aware of what a superb artist she is. And that I guess this isn't just another episode and another filmmaker, that we are talking about someone that was very special.
Yeah, beautifully said, Matt. And yes, Chantal Akerman, as I said in my intro, she really is one of the most impressive directors to ever live. All of the films we talked about today were made before she was 32.
Unbelievable, yeah. Unbelievable.
So the fact that she was able to, work with cinema this way, tell personal stories as well in this way, because like this type of really truly personal cinema, like that's something that was popping up a little bit at this time, but just being able to tell this narrative, being able to have this kind of like this unique authorist voice in a way to just explore our own loneliness as well through the medium, like something we've seen in books before, of course, but like this kind of over, it's just incredible. And knowing how her life ended as well, it's heartbreaking knowing how all of the connections between her entire filmography goes on to the very last film she made. Yeah, absolutely incredible. This is one of the best directors to ever live. It's one of the most important directors to ever live. And she's a director who has increasing importance today as her films are being more and more centered in the conversation, and more younger directors, especially women directors, are citing her as an influence. I think that, with Jeanne Dielman at the top of the rankings now, I think that this is something that will inspire more and more people for decades to come, even more than Akerman has done in the past. It will be really interesting to see just where she's in the pantheon in 10, 20, 30 years, because she's been catching up a lot this last decade. I think she will catch up even more. I think she will be centered into conversations even more, because people at now, we still have people who are resistant to like the power of her cinema. And I think, like you said, it might be a bit of like a spicy food where, you have to be accustomed to this kind of cinema. And I think that the fact that Akerman is now centered the way she is tells people that you need to start exploring contemplative cinema, slower cinema, minimalist cinema, whatever you want to call these things. And that there's such raw power that can be had there. And I'm really happy that, this last decade really has been her moment to grow and explode. It's just too sad she couldn't be here to see it herself.
Yeah, and I think just the amount of care and attention that's been lavished on her now after she's gone is, it's great, but it's also frustrating that it wasn't happening more when she was alive. And Just a quick plug, obviously, we're sort of looking at the early films here. There are various releases that have been made of her films. So I've got a box set from the BFI of Chantal Akerman Volume 1 from 67 to 78, which has got all of the films that we were talking about except for Toute, Nuit, which will be coming out in a Volume 2. The Criterion Collection has done some of her films as well in different ways, in different formats. But these are films that you can go out there and find that are not obscure anymore. And I'm looking forward to being able to see some more of the later films. I've seen some of her later films in the cinema, but I'm looking forward to, in a couple of months' time, maybe it will already have happened by the time you're listening to this podcast, that her later films are out as well. And they're well worth your attention and getting hold of the Blu-rays if that's how you watch films.
Absolutely. I think it's just part of a continuing story of Akerman making rounds. And hopefully her later films will get a similar kind of reemergence as her earlier films, because there's so many phenomenal films in her mid and late career as well. Perhaps Matt, and maybe even more of our co-hosts will sit down and talk about some of her later films at a later point. Let us know. We'll have a thread dedicated to this episode up on the ICM forum, so please come there, discuss Akerman. Let us know if you want more episodes on her work. Let us know if you disagree with any of our takes, and just debate these films in general. So hope to see you there, and if not, until next time, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.